If you were a kid in the 1990s, chances are you were a fan of Mortal Kombat. It tended to be a competitor to Capcom's mega-hit Street Fighter II. Mortal Kombat would smash into arcades and the public consciousness, causing controversy from politicians for its intense violence while gaining an entire generation of loyal fans with its unique characters, world building, and gameplay. And like any other 90s property, violent or not, it had its share of spin-offs aimed at children, including 2 movies, 2 TV shows, and a live-action stage show. Yes, there was a Mortal Kombat stage play. The Mortal Kombat franchise has persisted through some rough patches since the 90s, and now it's more popular than ever, pushing the boundaries of graphical quality and graphic violence with each new entry. After a couple decades on the market, it's safe to say that there are fans who have fond memories of the original 90s games, with their memorable stages, special moves, and characters. Well, most of those games at least. Because today, I don't want to just talk about the original MK games that were ported to the Nintendo Super Duper or the Sega Genesis, because everybody already knows about them. You already know about the No Blood Code, you already know people called it sweat, and arguably, it's way more gross that way. No, I want to talk about something far more gross than puddles of sweat being punched off of people. I want to talk about the incredible, ill-advised, ridiculously half-baked ports of the first 4 games that were put on handheld systems. You might know about Mortal Kombat, but you might not have ever seen it quite like this. After Mortal Kombat struck arcade gold in 1992, Midway put into action a plan to put not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 separate SKUs out on the same day in 1993. Enter September 13th, when 4 different versions of the original Mortal Kombat hit home consoles. And by home consoles, I mean the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, and Sega and Nintendo's handhelds, the Sega Game Gear and the Game Boy respectively. Now, if you're a young whippersnapper who grew up in the days of the Nintendo Advance and don't even remember when Sega was the name of a console manufacturer, you might be scratching your head wondering, what's a Game Gear? Well, the Sega Game Gear was an invention by the Sega company to be basically a never-ending black hole that you would just throw batteries into for hours on end. It also played video games on a backlit and full-color LCD display, meaning that technologically, while it was a huge battery sucker, it was kind of light years ahead of Nintendo's Game Boy, at least technologically speaking, where the Game Boy was still stuck with its monochrome palette and no backlit LCD display. And it's between these 2 handhelds that our story will primarily unfold, as Sega was battling Nintendo on every front they could. And of course, they both wanted a piece of the pie when it comes to something like Mortal Kombat, which was one of the biggest games on the market. And thus the stage is set for our tale. In the holiday season of 1993, I can only imagine the legions of bloodthirsty Mortal Kombat grade schoolers rushing under their Christmas trees looking for Game Boy or Game Gear shaped boxes, ravenously ripping open the wrapping paper, imagining the infinite vast possibilities that are now available to them, that they can take their favorite fighting game on the go. I can see it now, practicing fatalities, beating Shang Tsung, fighting Goro, all on the school bus or at recess. It's a dream come true, it's the best Christmas ever, and just as you're about to look at your mother and father and tell them that they're the best parents who ever walked the planet, your entire reality is shattered when you realize that those handheld versions are not the versions you want to play. Let's start with the worst first, which is the Game Boy version. While this was captured on a PC using an emulator, so you might be thinking that, oh, this is just an emulation glitch, but no, this is actually how the game played. The ill-defined slideshow you see before you is exactly what graced the screens and eyeballs of little tykes the world over when they popped this game into their system for the first time and played it for about 2 minutes before realizing that their parents hate them. I want to be very clear here. There are some games I've checked out already for the show that I can definitely see being good at the time. There's no way that Mortal Kombat on the Game Gear was good in any time, across any realm. While the game does a fairly impressive job of actually including the whole Mortal Kombat roster, minus Johnny Cage, but who cares? that is a small consolation when it plays like this. The controls are unnecessarily laggy, the AI can be really frustrating to fight against, and the slideshow presentation doesn't really help any of it. While there is music and sound effects that do their best to emulate the original game, and some very, very basic fatality animations, you're also missing out on Reptile, and there are a lot fewer stages, so it's just a really, really half-hearted port, especially if you're looking to play Mortal Kombat on the go. So how much better could a Game Gear port be? Well, a fair bit, actually. In addition to having a much expanded color palette, so you can actually tell who characters are against some of the backgrounds, Mortal Kombat on the Game Gear has much tighter gameplay, which means you can actually throw out special moves, unlike the other version. Though some of the special moves will be harder than others, and not gonna lie, I stuck with Liu Kang and Scorpion for most of these games, because I kinda know their inputs. The game also swaps Kano for Johnny Cage, so you kinda gotta pick your version depending on if you're a Johnny or a Kano main in the original Mortal Kombat on a handheld, which, why would you care? It's a vastly improved port over the Game Boy game, and is actually a lot more playable, but still, I'm not sure why you would want to, especially given the Game Gear's notorious battery-guzzling nature. Then again, maybe that makes this the perfect way to play Mortal Kombat on the go, at least if you were in the mid-90s. Having played a lot of the original Mortal Kombat with the Jax plug-and-play version that came out in the early 2000s, I can kinda see the appeal here, and honestly, if I was a kid who didn't know any better, I'd probably have sunk a couple hours into this version preferably. But after two mostly lackluster ports of a popular game that you'd think somebody like Acclaim and Midway would learn their lesson and not try and port a more advanced sequel like Mortal Kombat 2 to both of the devices again. And you would be wrong! Mortal Kombat 2 on the Nintendo Game Boy dropped October 27, 1994, a little over a month after the Game Gear, Sega Genesis, and SNES versions, and boy howdy do I pity you if you were waiting for it to come to the Game Boy back then. But that's not to say that this is a game on the level of the first Mortal Kombat port, because it's actually a lot better. Impressively, you have 8 characters to choose from, though 3 of them are palette swap ninjas, being Reptile, Sub-Zero, and Scorpion, and if I didn't know these games so well, I wouldn't be able to tell who was who based on the character select screen. They all just look like the same ninjas in the Game Boy's monochromatic style. But still, they all have unique moves, and 8 characters is not only 2 characters more than the original version on the Game Boy, but a pretty impressive roster for a Game Boy game. Also impressive is that even though the game still mostly plays like a sideshow, it's a lot more responsive and you can actually get out special moves and inputs, making this probably the best Nintendo handheld version of the game, at least for a while. I was honestly surprised putting in this game and almost beating the entire arcade ladder and switching off between different characters, finding I was actually having an okay time. Maybe it was just me getting used to the input lag and the ridiculously poor frame rate, but this version isn't nearly as bad as the first one. In fact, I wouldn't have been too bummed if I had had this as a kid. I think the black and white is a little bit distracting, but they kind of make the most of it, and the sprites are well animated enough. On the Game Gear side of things, the port of Mortal Kombat 2 was honestly even more impressive. Look at that opening start menu screen. They tried so hard to make that look like the arcade original, and it would have blown my mind as a kid. The frame rate is still a little bit rough, and the animation frames that each character has are a lot lower than you would want to play Mortal Kombat with, but kind of like the Game Boy version, this is an improvement over the first one, so it was your best bet for playing Mortal Kombat on the go back then. It also included way more visible blood and fatalities, so if you were into the more gory side of things, you could always kick that off on the school bus. The background stages are also a lot more detailed, so at a glance, it kinda looks like a pretty okay port. With the easier inputs and the combos, I found myself playing a lot more of this than I even intended to. And overall, the Mortal Kombat 2 ports are pretty impressive for what they pulled off. Oh man, I can't imagine what they're going to do with Mortal Kombat 3 or Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. Like all those cool characters like Sector and Cyrax. It's gonna be awesome if they improved as much as they did between the first game and the second game, between the second game and the third game on Game Boy and Game Gear. Can you imagine? Oh man, Mortal Kombat 3 must have been it must have blown kids' minds in the 90s. Oh, it got a lot worse. Developed by Williams and Software Creations, Mortal Kombat 3 tried, I guess? Kinda? You got 7 characters, so it's not quite as many even as the last game, but they are all pretty unique. You have a Cyborg, Sonya, Sub-Zero, Shiva, Sindel, and some of the others. You don't have any Striker though, so, I mean, what are we even doing here? But any hope you'll have after that main menu screen is quickly doused because Mortal Kombat on the Game Boy is an unintelligible mess of a game, especially considering the monochromatic nature of this game and how much detail they try to maintain from the Mortal Kombat 3 sprites. Not only is the frame rate and controls way worse than Mortal Kombat 2, but the AI difficulty is amped up. Even on the lowest difficulty, I tried for an hour and still could not get past Kano. I could barely get out a fireball or any input for that matter with any character. I can only imagine that what happened with Mortal Kombat 3 for Game Boy and Game Gear was that it got rushed out the door because this game needed so much more polish, and honestly, if it had gotten it, it could have been better than even Mortal Kombat 2, which was already a passable port for the technology at the time. Sadly, not even the Game Gear version came out unscathed in this bloody portable battle royale. The game is still an unintelligible slideshow with incredibly busted hitboxes and blinky animations that you can't really even tell what's going on half the time. Of course, presentation isn't helped at all by both versions having awful sound design with no background music and a host of sound effects that sound less like you're in an interdimensional kung fu battle and more like you got stuck inside an Atari 2600. It does feature fatalities and the running system for Mortal Kombat 3, though with the system's very basic button configuration, I couldn't quite figure out how to work it, and honestly, I'm not sure how well it would work anyway, given how laggy some of the inputs are. This is just such a shame for the series because, honestly, I could see after the improvements of Mortal Kombat 2, MK3 being a pretty big improvement. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be, but while Game Gear never saw another Mortal Kombat game, Nintendo's Game Boy Color would. And it's a game that's both somehow better and worse than these games at the same time. Mortal Kombat 4 for the Game Boy Color is exactly the kind of game I wanted to cover on this series. The audacity somebody had to make this, publish this, and then charge money for it is staggering to me. Released in 1997 by Midway, it's terrible, but also might be the best playing game of the Mortal Kombat series up to this point on handheld systems. I never had a problem getting off inputs, there are some very light combos, and this game actually has fully animated, though not very well, fatalities. This is a port of a game on a Nintendo handheld that shows you Quan Chi's leg rip fatality. That's amazing. But pretty much every other aspect of this game, well, no, that aspect too, all looks pretty terrible. The color design is just so garish and awful, especially compared to the Game Gear, which was a couple years earlier. All the menus seem like just basic placeholders with blocky backgrounds against whatever letters and numbers they needed to stand out for the player. There's also this really awful droning Game Boy theme that is playing constantly no matter what you do. I honestly think I'd rather just have the original Game Boy version of MK3 with almost no sound, thank you. But having said all of that, Mortal Kombat 4 on the Game Boy isn't that terrible. I mean, sure, it's a visceral assault on most of the senses, but you can play it. It doesn't have all the frames of animation you want, but you can actually get out moves and combos in a okay manner. Like the original Mortal Kombat 4, it suffers from not having many of the familiar characters you might want in the game, and unfortunately, the endings don't have the beautiful, beautiful cinematic qualities that would go on to make Mortal Kombat 4 an infamous entry in the series.
You have to arrest me! Wait! This is brutality! You can't do it!
Wrong, Jarek. This is not a brutality. This is a fatality.
Nope. Instead, when you beat the game, you can just expect a static screen of text. Oh, and I forgot to mention, one of the reasons why this game is so easy is because all the opponents are too stupid to block high. Yeah, you can just, jump over and kick your opponents to death. That's what I did for Shinnok with Liu Kang, and he barely even scratched me. But honestly, going back to these games as a curiosity, I'd much, much rather have them be way easier than way harder than necessary. It was more fun to dig through this game than it was for Mortal Kombat 3, where I could barely even get past the first character. But speaking of difficulty, what came next for Mortal Kombat on handheld might just be the worst one, bar none. Mortal Kombat Advance was the first of what would be eventually 3 games on the Game Boy Advance system, and it packed in more than 20 characters. It looked way better. It was based on Mortal Kombat 3. How did they mess up Mortal Kombat 3 again? Infamously, series creator Ed Boon would go on to say that Mortal Kombat Advance is one of his biggest shames in the series. And for a series that gave you stuff like this? That's a pretty big regret to have. Having played it, I can definitely see why though, because good God, why, Ed Boon? Not only is it harder to get off combos and special moves than it was 2 handheld generations ago with Mortal Kombat 3 on the Game Boy, but this game's difficulty will crush you. I give my hat to anybody who can beat this game, even on the default setting, because it is so ridiculously hard. Every AI enemy seems to be set to infinite combos, and the only way you can play and win is to just get the fastest character and spam them in the corner with projectiles, which, if I'm being real, isn't very fun. The backgrounds are also pretty grimy and ugly, and the limited frames of animations don't make it look anywhere near as smooth as I feel like it should be, especially when you consider some of the other amazing handheld fighters on the system, like the bonkers port of Street Fighter Alpha 3. It's entirely possible to make this kind of game work. And thankfully, that's evidenced by the next 2 games to hit Game Boy Advance, starting with Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, a incredibly ambitious port of the 3D era of Mortal Kombat games that not only is competently 3D with sprite-based graphics and full 3D arenas, but was the best Mortal Kombat had ever played on a handheld up to that point. Deadly Alliance on Game Boy Advance managed to pack in a decent amount of characters, an entire crypt full of unlockable extras, and the entire weapon switching and style switching system that was on the console game. Granted, a lot of it was pared down to fit on the Game Boy Advance's much, much more modest hardware and button layout, but this is exactly what you would want from a Mortal Kombat port at the time. Almost none of the combos or timing really matches one-to-one with the original game, so it's kind of its own beast in a weird way. You're not going to get this to practice on the bus in between matches. But that's what makes it all the more fascinating, that this game can stand on its own. It also bears saying that while Tournament Edition is technically a sequel, it's not MK Armageddon sequel so much as just an update with some removed characters, some new characters, and stages. It improves the gameplay somewhat, but overall, if you played one, you've kind of played both of them, so choose your poison if you want to revisit this era of Mortal Kombat. And that about does it. While there were some other ports of games, including Mortal Kombat Unchained, which was a PSP port of a PS2 game, Mortal Kombat 9 on the PlayStation Vita, and Mortal Kombat 11 on the Nintendo Switch, like always, I don't really count those because those weren't crafted from the ground up for the system, they are ported down from other systems. And though all three of those games played well enough and garnered some pretty good reviews and decent followings, it's important to look back at the roots of the series on handheld because Mortal Kombat has been a handheld series literally as long as it's been a console series. Since day one on the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, Mortal Kombat was there and followed those consoles on handheld all the way throughout the 3D era, all the way into today. And yeah, it was a rough growing period. And honestly, I can't recommend revisiting most of these outside of weird curiosities in increments of 10 to 15 minutes. Especially Mortal Kombat 3 and Mortal Kombat Advance. It's just not worth it. Like, just look up some YouTube long plays or something and that should get you sorted. But some of the other games in the series, including Mortal Kombat 2, are a reminder of how strange and ambitious some of these spin-offs can be, and even games like Tournament Edition and Deadly Alliance remind us that good ports and spin-offs are less about capturing the fidelity of the console game and more about capturing how it feels to play. So even with all the bumps and bruises, there are some games in the Mortal Kombat handheld legacy that are worth remembering.